My name is Dan Goldzband. I'm an av geek.
No!
Hi, Dan.
You're not in recovery.
I am not. I miss PSA every day. But before I start talking about it, I think I should show you my credentials. I don't like to read my slides. I'll let you go over it yourself. Oh, yeah. But there's one more credential that qualifies me to be standing here, even attending today. I am an
That's good.
That's the right main gear of the prototype 727 in storage in Everett before it was flown a few miles south and put on permanent display. We had the run of the back room of every museum that day. It was wonderful at Av Geek Fest. This is what I want to talk about today. But they told me that before I got down into the financing and marketing and so on, I should show you some airplanes.
Yes.
So we'll start with that. We'll take a tour of PSA's history in terms of its fleet. And this is how it started. A single leased DC-3, which very quickly started being operated in excess of the terms permitted in the leasing agreement. But they still managed to succeed and built up a fleet of several of them and moved up to DC-4s. This is taken in San Diego, by the way. And if that color scheme looks a little familiar, there's no coincidence. I don't know for sure if they bought used Capital 4s. I can't remember.
They did.
Okay. Well, you know, it costs a lot less just to change the logo in front. They did have a DC-6 for a while, but pretty quickly in the early 60s, I believe it was the very early 60s, they switched to the Electras. I think that's a John Proctor photo, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, probably.
1959.
59? Okay. You'll notice the wording above the windows. Electrajet. Now look how it changed.
Super Electrajet.
That was after the modifications. Same location on the ramp at the old terminal on Pacific Highway in San Diego.
There's the sign
And-
with the Condor liner.
Yeah. And you'll notice at the front of the window stripe, the original logo of the Flying Shield. That has disappeared. And this is really where I start remembering the airline myself as a very young San Diego. Taking off, again at San Diego with the old Convair buildings in the background and a rather blurred 990 getting ready for delivery.
Garuda.
Is that what it was?
Yep.
Thank you. I've often wondered what it was. They got rid of the Electras, but they bought some back many years later in order to serve Tahoe. I actually flew into Tahoe on an Electra, but I did it on Air Cal, which also had to bring back a couple of its Electras. It's an interesting place to fly into. You land in the woods. And oftentimes those flights were operated out of SFO. They moved into an all-jet fleet, or moving toward it, in the mid-60s. Here's the very early 100s. And there's a personal story, the first of several you'll hear, to go with this. I remember very clearly the day that they started operating this aircraft for the first time. It was a big story on the local news, which of course we always had on, and we were watching it. And what did we see? But my mother's brother, my uncle Leo Niederberger, who had been visiting from Chicago, climbing the stairs into that plane on his way to visit his son in the Bay Area. So we developed a personal relationship with the airline rather early, as did many people. That will be a recurring theme this morning. This afternoon. The paint job, modified. Actually, this is closer to the original DC-4 job, isn't it? And this is on the ramp at the then new terminal at Lindbergh Field, which I'm very glad to say is about to be torn down and replaced as soon as we finish the new terminal. And the smile appears. I love the theme building, by the way. And the smile continues to appear. This is many years later in the final livery. Again, looks like SFO to me. Just a lovely shot of the plane with Mission Hills in San Diego in the background. Smiling away. One website put it beautifully about the appearance of the planes and the smile. Just happy to be an airplane. And I think all of us can agree with that. One final change in the livery from the solid font to I don't know what to call it, a relief font?
Open, hollow font.
Hollow.
Oh, what was it?
Hollow.
Hollow, yeah.
Well, the other change is the pink went to orange.
Yeah, that's right. But the smile was all over. And it really became the symbol of the airline. To the extent that even non-Californians, people from back east, knew, oh, that's the airline with the smile on its planes. And it became very much a symbol of California. But there was one other aesthetic contribution that you know what I'm going to talk about, that PSA made to California popular culture, and I would be remiss if I didn't at least give it a little mention. This is probably, of all the photographs, and believe me, I've looked at a lot of them, probably the most representative one, and most used one. I confess now, I look at it with somewhat mixed views. On the one hand, then and now I've got as much testosterone going through my blood as anybody. On the other hand, as the father of 2 professional women, I do not think the workplace is really quite the right locale any longer for objectification. As Ecclesiastes said, there is a time and a place for everything. But I think it offers an opportunity to gain an insight. And to do that, I want to talk about my dear friend Leslie, whom I've known since high school, who is probably the second most liberated feminist woman I ever knew, exceeded only by the daughter of Gloria Allred, who was a student of mine at UCLA. And Leslie really surprised me a few years ago when she told us how disappointed she was as in her late teen years that she was just too short to become a PSA stewardess. I thought, that's funny. How do you reconcile a statement like that with the woman who in our freshman year of high school said that men only looked at women as sex objects? And when she said it, I guiltily kept my mouth shut. Well, I think it can be reconciled. Leslie never said she was disappointed because she couldn't be a stewardess for American or United or Delta or Western. She talked about how much fun it would be to fly PSA around California. She didn't talk about it. And she called that glamorous. She didn't talk about flying to New York, Paris, London, or Tokyo. Flying between San Diego, LA, San Francisco, San Jose, Burbank, Ontario. How many of you have been to Ontario? How many were there in the 70s? I went to Claremont, I know. I don't think Leslie was really talking about being an airline stewardess. And how could she, given her statement, accept the idea of going to work looking like this? I think she was responding to PSA, as we all did. We loved that airline. It was part of us as Californians. I'll get back to that theme later. But right now, let's get back to the planes. They did acquire a few 737s, and I'll tell you another story. In high school, I actually took a girl on a date on one of these. The airline would oftentimes fly charity flights, $5 or $10 a seat, and they'd have a scenic flight around the pattern and donate all the proceeds to the United Way. And the girl who sat next to me in history was kind of cute, and she'd never been on an airplane before. So there you are. That's about all there is to say about that.
Gonna ask.
I'm afraid not, guys. I'm afraid not. Actually, I lost interest. But at least I brought one more person into the flying fraternity, you know. And they were around long enough to get the new livery. Interesting contrast between the new livery on the 737 and the old one on the 727. Eventually, PSA also operated DC-9s, and eventually the MD-80 series replaced all the 727s, which was a very good move for them. And yet, planes were happy to keep working away and charging around, as you can see. But not everything they did was a good idea. I like to say sometimes that I don't think PSA ever met an airplane salesman it didn't like. Actually, this picture was taken on approach to Manchester, England. Lockheed sent this plane on a around-the-world sales tour with PSA stewardesses, by the way. PSA ordered 5, only took 2 on delivery. I think they operated them for as maximum 6 months. They spent 2 years sitting on the ramp in San Diego as PSA litigated with Lockheed. It was a bad idea to start with, compounded by a downturn in the economy that just made it a terrible situation. This was a better idea, at least. Certainly a plane whose size and operating specs was well suited to the growth of the small cities they were operating into around the West. Picture on the upper left, I believe at LAX, lower right, San Diego. But someone didn't quite do their job. They wanted 6 across seating in that plane. You know what happened. And when it was installed, the curvature of the cabin made it impossible to stand up on the outermost seats. They had to change it to a 5 across. Now that sounds like a disaster. I wonder if it really was. On the one hand, you'd think it's a terrible thing to give up 1/6 of your revenue capacity. On the other hand, if you're normally running a 75 to 80% load factor, you haven't really surrendered very much. You might have actually taken a few pounds off. But it wasn't the only problem with that plane. I read that one stewardess said that BAE really stood for bring another engine.
Well, they also had pictures of sort of a spoof of a mechanic with his lunchbox going home and an engine under the other arm.
Yeah. The maintenance problems on these airplanes are very well documented.
Yeah. I flew one into Boise, as a matter of fact. Well, that's a story. So we were going skiing. We flew LAX SFO to Boise on one of these, and I'd never been to Boise. And so in SFO, I stuck my head into the cockpit and I asked the crew, what's the approach into Boise like? And they said, we don't know. We've never flown there before. Typical PSA response. And then a last picture that I think really shows the progression and evolution toward the very end. We'll take a deep breath and we'll switch from the aircraft to the analytical part of the presentation. Although actually, we've already just started the analytical because it's as much an emotional analysis as it is a financial and marketing and governance analysis. I want to cover all those bases. But what I also want to do is lead off with a paraphrasing of a line from Mark Antony's funeral oration from Julius Caesar. I have come not to praise PSA, but to analyze it. And to do so, there are two big questions I have. Was it justified to sell the airline financially? Why didn't PSA become a successful niche carrier like Alaska? I don't think it stood a chance of becoming what Southwest is. But it was already growing to be something like Alaska. Before I go on, let me quiz you guys. Anybody, other than Dan, an employee at PSA? One at least, okay. You know, that's more than I got at the Air and Space Museum.
Really?
Yes. Any vendors? Any other service providers in the aviation business that interacted with a PSA on any basis? Passengers? Yeah, okay, that's
Frequent flyer program.
I never, you PSA frequent flyer? I have a tag on my briefcase that's from some executive flyer. I bought it on eBay.
That is PSA's frequent flyer program.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah.
Flew LA San Francisco and US Air in 91, but I don't think that counts.
No, I'm afraid not.
Maybe.
Any corporate customers? And you don't have to identify yourselves, but I pity you.
By association.
There we go.
Okay, good enough, good enough.
Yeah.
So back to the question. It is a financial question. So let's dig into a little bit of finances, but I'm not going to show you numbers. I'm going to show you graphs. It's a lot easier. Let's start with revenue. And you can see that revenue, with one exception, climbed steadily, in fact, at an increasing rate over the airline's last 18 years. I don't think Shea Oakley came to the meeting this year.
No, he's not here.
I was talking to him in Phoenix 3 years ago, and I told him about wanting to do this presentation, and he opined that PSA did just fine as long as California's population was growing, and when that stopped, PSA hit a wall.
Is this indexed for inflation?
No, raw numbers, raw numbers.
Okay, because they started, you could buy a ticket for $6.50.
Okay, another story. The first airline ticket I ever bought with my own money was on PSA. I was in 9th grade, and my synagogue, which was Beth Israel in downtown San Diego, was going up to a camp up in Malibu to have a weekend with Emmanuel up in Beverly Hills.
S. Kramer?
What?
S. Kramer.
S. Kramer, yeah. Actually, it was Gimblin Hilltop.
Okay.
But yeah. And 3 of us didn't get out of school in time to catch the bus. I said, that's no problem. I'm sure they're sending people from Emmanuel on cars. Just have someone swing by LAX and pick us up. We'll fly PSA. Everybody thought that was perfectly reasonable. It's what everyone did. You didn't drive to LA. You flew. So my mother dropped the 3 of us off at 3 p.m. or 3:30 at Lindbergh Field. We walked into the terminal, and I walked up to the counter and said, "1 to LA, please." And the agent said,
Ching.
No, he said $8, and I said, what?
$8.
8? It had always been 6. That was my first airline ticket. But anyhow, I decided to test what Shea said, and it doesn't hold up.
Nope.
The orange graph at the bottom is the percent increase every year of California population, and it very gradually rose. It never stopped growing. But look at the revenue line, the red revenue line for PSA, that with one exception, well, actually it never stopped growing. And in contrast, especially in the last few years, to both the California population and the blue line, the California state GDP, PSA's revenue grew faster. Of course, maybe that's partially due to its expansion into western states. There's all kinds of levels you can put it in, but I think this refutes the Oakley hypothesis. But revenue is only the beginning, and it's not what we mean by making money. Net income is what we mean. The revenue minus corresponding expenses for the same time period. And the story is not so rosy here. Not a problem that is unique to PSA. But their net income was highly variable. Fans of Top Gun will remember the admonition on the second exercise not to go below hard floor of 10,000 feet. Well, there's a hard floor in finance too, and it's the orange line. Violating it is not so horrific as violating physical hard floor, but each of them is equally unsustainable in the long run. And PSA was not doing so well those last few years. Charting that against revenue, and note that you have a scale on each side of the graph, one for each line. Something was going on there. In spite of rising revenue, of course, costs were going up, oil was going up, and so on.
This is not unique, though, to this airline.
It is not, and you will see more of that in the next couple slides when I take this into other metrics. Yeah, not unique, not unique. But before we go forward, let me just set a little historic context, just so we know what events benchmark this progression. So there's the first oil shock and the mechanics strike, which I flew during, as a matter of fact, with a little nervousness. That is when the longstanding CEO and chairman, J. Floyd Andrews, Andy, retired. The San Diego crash, which did not, I apologize for perhaps sounding cynical, but as in most cases, really did not affect financial performance that much. Lockerbie being the biggest exception. The second oil shock, a pilot strike, and then the surprise and tragic death of the second longtime CEO, Bill Shim. A real big tragedy for the airline. Very well respected, a pilot. It was a shame to see him go. As we proceed forward in a few slides, we'll be spending most of our time in this right-hand area after Bill Shim's death. Well, if you're going to compare companies, you can't just compare net income because different sizes make that ridiculous. But the basis for comparison is pretty much earnings per share, net income divided by the number of shares outstanding. And PSA's EPS pretty much mirrors the net income. Some differences due to differences in shares outstanding from year to year. But, as you said, is this really so different from other airlines? Let's have a look. All right, PSA is at the bottom of its California peer group. PSA, United, Delta, and Western. On the other hand, United wasn't necessarily doing all that well either. And furthermore, all three airlines' EPSs were converging. So although I can't say that PSA's financial performance is great, I can't say that its disappointing quality is so unique. Let's also look at the stock prices. Well, United, the yellow line, is going off in the stratosphere. I don't know why offhand. And Pan Am at the bottom, we don't need to talk about. But all of the others are reasonably well clustered, I would argue. And when we're talking about stock price, we're talking about the market's perception of the company's future prospects. That's what stock price means. And the market does not see PSA as a disaster here. Anyone, I think, would see that actually as an opportunity.
So one question on this slide.
Yes.
Once you hit 1985-86, PSA, the airline, was spun off back into a publicly traded company as part of the union contract in 1984.
Was it spun off separately?
It was a separate trading stock.
Okay.
So the question is, does that reflect that, or does this reflect PS Group, the holding company?
Goodness, I'm afraid I can't answer the question. But if I remember right, and correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't the ultimate sale at 17.5?
That I don't remember.
Yeah, I've got that in my memory for some reason. So what kind of conclusions can we draw from this, at least preliminary ones? Well, we've got a negative net income, negative EPS, the lowest EPS of the comparison group, regardless of whether it's the airline holding company or the airline itself. And that would lead one to say that this poor financial performance portends disappointing future results, sell it. On the other hand, a reasonably high and consistent stock price with the rest of the industry says that the market value of the stock indicates a positive future outlook. Hold on to it. I vote for the latter. I think that what we learn about management furthermore supports my argument. So why didn't they become what Alaska was, Alaska became? And it's really more of a marketing and organizational question. And this is my source for most of this. How many of you have seen this book? It's very good. Gary Cassell was with the airline for many, many years. And I think it's authoritative. At least I've not seen any refutations of anything he says. And just to try to keep things on the up and up, when I cite it, I give the page numbers. Strategy is at the core of this, and conventional business thinking says there are two kinds of strategy. You can be a cost leader or a product differentiator. Harvard Business School guru Michael Porter says you can only be one or the other. And yet PSA, I think, was both, as has Southwest been for much of its career. But note that each of them lead to the same situation in orange. That's where you want to be. Generate and sustain continuous revenues and income. Shareholders like consistency. Just again to reset our historical context, and again, we're going to be talking about the Schimpf era more than anything else. Not the Schimpf era, the Barclay era, Barclay College. And so here is the last CEO that was at the airline. And I'm not going to read this all to you. You can read faster than I can talk. He did do some marvelous financial work with them. But he was highly autocratic, directorial, isolationist. Examples? Someone named to me a successful organization that does not allow its managers to talk shop with each other. Crazy. Only someone who is a control freak would set down that kind of rule. Furthermore, as Senior Vice President of Finance, what gives him the authority to make a directive like that anyhow? Now this is an interesting. The fact that they sold the 737s is itself not a big deal. But proper corporate governance would not let even the CEO do that unilaterally. The acquisition or the disposition of any significant asset is the province of the board. So, actually, at this point, I'm going to point my finger not only at Barclay, but at the board of directors. They had what looked like very good people on it. But boards back then generally didn't do a very good job. And I think PSA's was in that category. Oh, and this one. Dan, I don't know if you ever heard about this. If you wanted to communicate with Paul Barclay, according to Cassell, you slid a piece of paper underneath his closed office door. If you were ever granted admission to the inner sanctum, you saw a series of cut-out footprints on the floor leading to his desk and then turning around and going out, telling you exactly what was expected. And my father is a retired psychiatrist. I am not one, but I picked up enough to start wondering. Immature interactions with passengers. My favorite story about this is Captain Bogle. I drink Paso Robles wine, so I drink wine from their vineyard a lot. He had the habit, after everything was checked and all the passengers were on board, of climbing up the back stairs, ducking into one of the heads, and coming out with dark glasses and a white cane to walk up the aisle. Barclay told him to stop doing it. Okay, look, there are many pilots in this room, and you're all much more qualified than I to say if it really was a distracting activity or not. But it's a very good example of how the company made a lot of humor.
Mike was one of the most interesting people I've ever met.
Really?
He was an absolute character
Uh-huh.
in every sense of the word.
Uh-huh.
He was also, for a time, PSA's entire crew scheduling department in the 60s.
Holy cow. Well, it was a small company back then. Any other good stories?
He was also an opera singer and sang at the Starlight Opera.
Really?
Yeah.
I wonder if I heard him.
You probably did. His daughter was a flight attendant for PSA/US Airways for almost 50 years.
And then he went up and started the winery, right?
Yeah.
No?
Yep.
Maybe that was someone else?
He passed away in 2010. His funeral was at the Catholic Church in Old Town. And
Oh, Our Lady of the Rosary.
very well attended.
I imagine so, yeah. Folks, anytime a financial professional just rejects objective evidence, it is one big red flag. This man was not comfortable with a people-centered organization. This man was not comfortable with competition. This man was not capable of considering a marketing-driven organization.
How'd they hire him?
Huh? Why'd they keep him?
And how did they get him in the first place?
Well, they got him because J. Floyd Andrews hired him. And I've got a comment about that too. And I think they needed him. The degree of financial rigor some years earlier at PSA was sorely lacking. And Barclay gave it to them. But I have a feeling that he was a good operator and was able to go around to the board, around the CEO, and probably developed a lot of allies there. And this was not a board that kept very close tabs. I wonder if any of them ever walked into his office and saw this.
Unfortunately, all of them have passed away, so you really can't ask them.
All of these
And
people.
the one person who would know, the executive secretary, does not talk.
Ferguson?
Nancy Carroll. She's still alive. Very lovely lady. Do not ask her anything that happened in those executive offices because she will.
Going earlier to J. Floyd Andrews, the CEO twice prior, he was also autocratic and controlling, but highly collaborative, open door policy. Very people-oriented. And a fixture in San Diego, I might add. I never met him, but I heard about him all the time. But he came around, you know. On the other hand, According to Kissel, Andy figured that if more cash was coming in than going out, things were fine. Well, that's like evaluating a sports team's success simply on the basis of its win-loss rate. Not quite enough to get good managerial control. But this, I think, is the real criticism. When you see that there was no HR department until the 1970s, what would Colleen say about that? I will have more to say about institutionalization of culture and strategy in a moment. What I'm not saying in this slide is everything I already said about Paul Barkley. Just not the man to lead a company into that environment. And I'm not saying it would have succeeded. I'm not kidding when I'm saying luck is always a factor. And it was not the only corporate meltdown we've seen. She certainly should have known what she was doing. She was good. Destruction of the most valuable company in the world. It needed to change. It did not need to be destroyed. I don't even need to talk about it. And let's get out of the corporate environment for a moment.
There you go.
2 teams left, and now they're playing with us in the Mountain West. And I'm a Bruin. But I don't want to leave you with just a negative impression of bad corporate marketing, culture, and positioning. I want to lead you with the knowledge and the certainty that it can go better. And to do that, I'm going to cite a company, also another company, a California company, but a nationwide one, probably one that all of you have done business with and like. That company is Trader Joe's. Contrast Joe Coulombe with Paul Barkley. Joe Coulombe was famous for understanding and empathizing with his customer. He always said that his customer was an unemployed PhD, which is rather appropriate for a company that got its start as a store in South Pasadena, just a couple of miles from Caltech. And you've got this unemployed PhD. I'm going to talk about the hypothetical, stereotypical, early Trader Joe's customer, man who's 26, 28 years old, and it's Saturday, and he's got a girl coming over for dinner, and no money. And you can go to Trader Joe's and buy decent stuff that looks exotic and interesting and will make a great impression. The rest of it is up to you. And from that, Trader Joe's has built an enormous following and takes excellent care of its employees. I don't do the majority of my shopping there. I don't know if any of us do, but I buy stuff there. They now carry frozen Bronzino, and it's good.
There's a good example of corporate culture.
Yes, a really good example. Yeah, and outside the airline industry.
Yes.
But we'll get back to the airline industry. There you are. I just added Sir Richard this morning. I wish PSA could have gotten Lamar Muse. And Herb, like all of us, had his flaws, but they knew how to build an organization. And Southwest needs to make changes, but it doesn't need to change the culture in order to do that. Every organization has to grow, just as we do. But that doesn't necessitate abandoning fundamental values. It means growing to encompass new ways of working. And you can't depend upon the leaders alone. But culture starts at the top. Strategy starts at the top. I deleted a slide that asked What is the most important responsibility of management? It is strategic orientation. That's the, of all of the possible tasks, that's the one that can only be done at the top. And PSA just lost it. I think they lost it because from J. Floyd Andrews' time, there was never a serious move to institutionalize the culture the way it was done at Southwest, the way it's been done at Virgin, the way for decades it was done at Hewlett-Packard. Anybody ever hear of the HP way? Yeah.
I got another name.
Yeah, what is it?
That you could add to this.
What?
Gordon Bethune.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's no secret that for Southwest, their manuals were PSA manuals when they first started.
Oh yeah, the print shop just ran them off again and deleted the word Pacific.
They made the statement that PSA taught Southwest how to be Southwest.
Or at least how to be an efficient airline. And then what Southwest did was extended on that.
And,
but they had a basis.
When you say that PSA may not have survived as a niche carrier,
yeah.
I'm not sure that I look at Southwest.
Well, I think with proper management they could have. I just am unwilling to say they would have.
Yeah.
But I got questions about Southwest future because I see huge change.
Yeah.
Did you hear the, which podcast was it last week? I can't remember it. I don't listen to anywhere near the number of podcasts I used to. But it's the one with Brent Snyder and the two other guys. Yeah. They really tore into it. And I did very well. Does anybody remember the name of that podcast?
Air Show.
Air Show?
Air Show.
Listen to Air Show last week. It's an excellent discussion. But, you know, they never said that the culture was the problem. It's other things. I want to leave with PSA's positive contributions all the same. Even from the tragic crash, good things came of it. And they really gave an enormous amount to the industry. For better, or some of us might say for worse. On the other hand, it cost me a lot less to fly across country than it cost my parents. Well, I'm going to close with another paraphrase from Shakespeare, from the same play. I'm going to paraphrase the words that Mark Antony goes on to say and adapt them to this situation. The actions of executives live on beyond their term. Barclay said that PSA needed to be like United. And Barclay was an honorable man. So were they all. All honorable men. My name is Dan Goldzband, and I miss PSA every day.